Thank you, Professor, for that wonderful talk, a bit about the book that you have written. So just to set the stage for further discussions, I would like to begin by asking you, sir, one basic question about the importance that you have given towards oil politics. Israel has also started discovering quite a bit of oil in the last almost 10, 11 years with the Leviathan and the other oil field up in the north. How far do you think that this is going to be an important component in promoting Israeli foreign policy in the years to come, sir, the oil politics?
I would correct you, it is important. It's not going to be important, it is important,
Right.
it's always been important because it is always dependent on import of oil. The first time where we have something significant in terms of oil is more related to gas than to oil. And that had to do with relation with Egypt and the gas excavations that we are conducting on the seashore, not far from Haifa and Tel Aviv. You should remember that at best, it could provide for something like 30% or 35% of Israel needs, which means that at least 70 or 80% of Israel need should come in terms of oil, not gas. Oil and not gas. Dependent on Britain and dependent on Iran has been replaced by dependent on Egypt for a very long time and dependent on the goodwill of the Russians under present circumstances. But the problematic is still there, dependency. How do you conduct diplomacy vis-a-vis, for example, the Russians who are providing arms to the Iranian, while at the same time benefiting from the proximity of Russian oil to Israel and the business run between these two states. The problem of oil in terms of research has been very close, the very strict secrecy involved on these issues. If you are an Israeli, if you rely on Israeli press, and even if you are not a non-Israeli, relying on other sources, you can really back me up by saying that this is one of the most kept secrets, most well-kept secret that Israel had for a very long time. The secrecy started as a law, which is still in existence, enacted in 1957. So from 1957 up to the present, Israelis are not free to discuss these issues. And what you have in the press is really bits and pieces. The whole story has not, and I think will not, for a very long time, be told. I was lucky to get access to the highly significant records of the oil company, of the oil committee, of the Ministry of the Treasury, of Israel's Treasury, and that enabled me to write a book about Israel oil diplomacy up to the early 60s. But the story from then on is very problematic. I would love to have the documents and to write a sequel. Unfortunately, I'm forced to do something else.
Thank you, Professor. May I request our former ambassador to Iran, Sanjay sir, to raise some of his comments or some questions to Professor Bialer? Sir?
Thank you, Alvite. Frankly, it's any talk on Israeli foreign policy is always fascinating about a country which has reinvented itself at many stages, and its foreign policy also at many stages. And what you said about 1956 piqued my curiosity. Is why did Israel read the American administration wrong at that stage? And why did it take nearly a decade to mend the relationship till the 67 war completely changed the environment? Could you comment on a little bit on that? Israelis' relations from 56 to 67 with the Americans.
These are super questions. necessitating a whole seminar, not just one short answer, but these are excellent topics, and you are really touching central points, central elements of the story. Let me start with the question about Israel's relation with with the United States. You want to the beginning, or what do you want?
Basically,
What?
basically, when you went along with Britain,
Yeah. Okay. Yes, Israel definitely mistook the American position in terms of the reaction to 1956. That was a mistake, which had to do with a situation which not many people are familiar with. And it had to do with basically with what I wrote about the pre-48 period, because Israel was, so to speak, an expert about Britain. Israel was expert about the Britain because Israel got the Balfour Declaration from the British in 1917. The British mandate was there, and relation with the outside world, including all non-British actors, went through London. So Israel was expert on London. Israel was a semi-expert about the Middle East. Israel was totally ignorant about the United States because there was no need for that at the time. So Israel did not develop diplomacy vis-a-vis the United States for a very long time. Remember that the British and the American were not always allies. We're speaking about the pre-Second World War era. So the problem was at times how to engage in relation with the United States without hurting or harming relation with the Brits, who controlled Palestine for very many years. So Israel was not really expert about the United States. Israel found it extremely difficult to engage in relation with the United States in the pre-56 era because of many other reasons. The Cold War did not play into Israeli hands for very good reason, and on which I wrote a whole book about between East and West. So it came late. It came late. This was in contrast to impression created in London and created in many other places in the world that Israel is really, even before 56, controlling the United States. Israel is I would say, the head. The United States government is the tail, and Israel is really leading or controlling American foreign policy, which was very far from the truth. And Moshe Sharet, our foreign minister, always instructed our diplomats not to correct that wrong impression that we are doing that. So, in terms of U.S. policy and your question, yes, you are definitely right. That was a basic mistake. I'm not sure whether Ben-Gurion would have decided on war had he known that would be the outcome of war. Now, your second question relate to the issue of the way late coming of the honeymoon between Israel and the United States, if I may put it bluntly. Yes, it came late for very many good reasons. It came late. Some of these reasons were still there even after 67. For example, U.S. relation with the Arab world didn't work to Israeli advantage for a very long time. Especially during this period. Israel had to prove its value in terms of strategy. And it found it extremely difficult to do that because 1956 was not a proof of the pudding, if I may say so. Although Israel won its battles in the Sinai, one should remember that the Egyptian army was not in Sinai at the time. The Egyptian army was in Egypt. Even prior to the war, and they were forced to run to save Egypt after the invasion of Port Said by the Brits. So, although Sinai was not empty, so to speak, that was kind of a luxury battles that Israel engaged in 56, which didn't prove really the value, the military value of Israel, especially as a counter-Soviet ally at the time. So it had to wait for 67 to prove that Israel was the best qualified military power in the Middle East, or at least was considered to be like that, and B, Israel could be relied politically speaking, especially in view of the solidification of the Russian position in Egypt and Syria, etc. So Israel could play this kind of a game only from the mid-late 60s, and it played to perfection, and the rest is history. I hope I answered some of your worries.
Thank you very much. I think it would be very interesting for the students who are listening in to this webinar.
I lovely teach them through the Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ambassador. May I request Professor Joseph Kéchichian from Lebanon to raise some of his queries or suggestions to Professor Bialer? Professor.
Thank you, Alvin. Thank you, Professor Bialer. Very comprehensive presentation, very useful. I have one small question and a larger question. The small question, to follow up to Ambassador Sanjay Singh's question about Iran, and you said in your presentation that oil was a key development in Israeli foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran, but also there was the Jewish question there as well. But obviously, Israel benefited from the Shah's openness, and you were supplied 100% of your needs. Therefore, there was a good relationship between Israel and Iran for decades. Now, in contrast, the relationship has gone sour. Perhaps you could evaluate whether the Israeli investment in Iran paid off. That's the simple question. The more interesting question in terms of, again, following on Ambassador Sanjay Singh's question about the United States played the role of a go-between between Israel and the Arab countries for many, many years. But now we have the Abraham Accords, and Israel has established diplomatic relations, not just with Egypt and Jordan, but now with the UAE and with Bahrain, and perhaps soon with Saudi Arabia as well. How do you, from an Israeli perspective, see developments growing, if you would like, between the Arab Gulf states and Israel? Thank you.
Well, here goes another 2 seminars. Your question is, well, you can't really do justice. This very good point that you make, and the question, the queries, would be a topic for a whole yearly seminar. The intriguing question, nobody asked me that. I must confess to you, nobody really asked me whether it paid off. It's a very intriguing kind of a question, which forced me to think quickly. I think the answer is definitely yes, for a couple of reasons. First of all, in terms of relations, personal relations, human relations, political relations, international relations, we are speaking about issues which are not forever. Peace is there for a certain period of time, war is there for a certain period of time, animosity is for a couple of years. Everything changed, everything is fluid, everything moves. That makes international relations, human relations, personal relations interesting. Because unlike the Greek tragedy, things develop in terms of the areas covered. So, first of all, you can't really expect situation to exist forever. A. B. Israel greatly benefited from relation with Iran. Oil, you can't really underestimate the position of oil. I mean, you can't. Israel could not survive without Iranian oil. Simply as that. So And there was nobody there to provide for Israel oil at the time. Nobody could really secure Israel in terms of oil. Israel depended on oil after 78. After 78. So in terms of energy, the answer is definitely yes. Is definitely yes. And that leaves us with some extra benefit that Israel got from relation with Iran, and that had to do with strategic cooperation, with intelligence. We don't know, we don't have the files. Very few pieces came to the open. Some of them, after the Iranian got control of the U.S. embassy in Tehran, they got their hand on CIA documents, and they published much of them in a book, which really shared some secrets about relation between Iran and Israel. Extremely interesting piece of evidence. The time after the Muslims got control over Iran was a golden time for other revelation made by the Iranian government, trying to demonize the Shah and the relation with Israel. They share many secrets with the world, including some interesting and intriguing fact that Israel had a whole intelligence station in northern Iran with the knowledge of the Iranian station, not a single operator, a station. So there is much more than meets the eye in terms of that. Israel, the relation with Iran provided ammunition to Israel relation with other states. With Turkey, it was easier to present the Turkeys as not special in their wish to develop relation with Iran, relation with Ethiopia, and relation with the CIA, relation with the United States. So I would definitely put it on the benefit. Of course, it came to an end in 78, but Israel from 78 found ways to cope with energy. There was the American connection, good, excellent relation with the United States. So situation in 78 was totally different than situation in 56 or 62 or 67. So the answer is yes. The answer is yes, and I'm ready to testify in court about that if you want. Now about you're asking about relation with the United States. Why did it come late? You have to go and ask the Americans, why did it come late? The Israelis really wanted that. Israel developed relation with Africa, and Israel developed relation with France, but they were all thinking about the big brother, the big sister, the big supporter of the State of Israel, and even supporters in the foreign ministry, and even Shimon Peres, if you press him very hard, would admit that relation with France was very, very limited in terms of time, in terms of the ability to extract something from the relation aside from arms. The French did not agree to give Israel 1 franc in terms of economic aid. Not a single French minister visited Israel formally from 1952 to, I would say, the 60s. The 60s. I'm speaking about the unbelievable situation, unbelievable phenomenon. The same applies to relation with Africa. Africa could not provide Israel with much of what it needed. Israel needed the big ally, and the big ally could only be found in the United States. So the reason why it was not developed had very little to do with the Israeli needs. It had to do with American, and you had to bring an American experts to enlarge on that. I hope I answered some of your questions.
You did. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So we have a question from one of our friends, Dipanwita. Dipanwita, if you can unmute yourself and ask Professor your question.
Hi, sir. I'm Dipanwita. Actually, I just wanted to know who really decides the foreign policy in Israel? Is it the IDF or is it the foreign ministry?
Okay. Another seminar goes. Uh, I shall give you the answer by an example. From 1957 to 90, I would say 1970 or 67 to 70, Israel, one of the basic aims of Israel foreign policy was to develop relations with Africa, south of the Sahara. People were not realizing for a very long time until documents really open up, some of the documents are open up, that there were two players. Israel was really presented by two players on the arena, on the African arena. The first player was the foreign ministry, and that is a clear, very obvious answer to your question. The foreign ministry had control over much of what Israel was doing in international arena, with exceptions, and I'm ready to enlarge on that if you want me to do that. But as parallel with the activities of the foreign ministry, and not always in cooperation and in coordination with the foreign ministry, were the actions taken by the Mossad in Africa. They conflicted in many respects, and they provide a very rich document about the ongoing conflict, which is still very much with us, between what Israel is defined as the seashore, the basis of the Mossad in Tel Aviv, and the mountain of Jerusalem, where the foreign ministry is. So the conflict between the mountain and the seashore in terms of foreign policy is still very much with us. So the partial answer to your question is that if you want to really understand the foreign policy of Israel, don't ever rely exclusively on foreign ministry perspective. There are always the military perspective, the secret service elements, the public opinion, the ideological issues. And this is again one of the basic flaws of former work on Israel, relying on either solely on the military or solely on the foreign ministry. They work together, but more time than often, they really conflicted with each other. So the study of Israel foreign policy is more complicated than meets the eye, and really I can't give you a satisfying answer in such a short time.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Dipanwita. Thank you, Professor. So we have another question from one of our professors, Sameena, Hameed, ma'am. Ma'am, if you can unmute yourself and ask Professor the question.
Yeah. Thank you, Alvite. Thank you, Professor, for that very interesting glimpse of your book. And my question is, as an expert on Israel's foreign policy, as a person who have been so intensely involved in the making of and remaking of it, what are your discontents of Israel's foreign policy, if you have any? Thank you.
What do I agree and what I disagree with Israel foreign policy?
Yeah, maybe what would be your critique of Israel's foreign policy?
I wouldn't want to go to critique. Really, I wouldn't want to critique. I'll tell you what my view of the situation, without going into blaming ministries, prime ministers, or etc. Me as a citizen of Israel, I was born in Israel. I was raised by a socialist family who came to Palestine from Poland in the 30s. So they were saved the Holocaust, but they settled in the country. They were pioneers. I was born into a very Zionist family, so the perspective is relatively clear in terms of the basic approach, positive approach to the state, to the experience, to the experiment, to the aim, and to the view, the general view accepted in Israel, which was termed Zionism or socialist Zionism. To my opinion, Israel could not exist without peace with the Arabs. Although I spoke about the Arab-Israeli conflict or the peace with the Arabs as a mean and not to an end, but if you take everything together and you try to cook an Israeli dish together, to my opinion, is that eventually, I'm not relating to the current affairs or 5 years from now, but eventually, there's no hope of running a normal country without sharing the land with the Palestinians, for very good reason. I don't think I have to share with you what you always know and you always claim. The reasons for that, to my mind, goes far beyond defense, far beyond moral in terms of relation with the Palestinians. It had to do with moral existentialist problem of Israelis as I see. Control over the Palestinians runs the grave risk of creating in Israel a way of life which I don't condone. I want something else. I want democracy. I want a liberal democracy. I want peace for our sake. I want no more for our children and for my 10 grandchildren. I want something else. Now, if you don't do that, if you don't try your best to break that magical chain of events, you're running a very grave risk. It does not have to be necessarily tomorrow. It does not have to be with some piece of diplomacy. It had to do with I would say what the Germans call the Weltanschauung. I mean, how do we look at things? That's the basic approach that I would recommend. If you want to translate that into accusing, blaming, criticizing, well, you're free to do that. I can speak only about myself.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Professor. So we have a couple of questions from one of our friends, like who cannot ask for some issues related with the internet at her end. I will ask on her behalf, sir. The first question that she has is, that Jews are settled globally and many are fine with not returning. How do you see the...
I didn't understand what you're saying.
Yes, sir. Actually, we have a couple of questions from one of our friends.
Yeah, but the question,
yes, yeah. What I'm coming to that, sir.
Okay.
And what she wrote is, keeping in mind that Jews are settled globally, and many are fine with not returning to Israel. How do you see the relevance of Promised Land on the contemporary understanding of Zionism?
I really don't understand the question. What is the specific question?
Okay, sir. I'll ask her to rephrase it and send it back, sir. And the second question that she has is, what are the major change in Israel's approach to US in terms of real politics and long-term impact on Israel-Arab relations? Can Israel and Arabs have the capacity to hold agreement without major US involvement in Biden administration?
Okay, let me start with the second question.
Right,
the role of the US in the peace process.
Right, sir.
Traditionally speaking, aside from certain elements of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I refer to the Camp David Agreement, perhaps others, basically speaking, Israelis and Arabs basically engage in a direct diplomacy in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The major achievement in terms of peace with the Arab world were secured without American involvement. Think about the peace with Egypt, which is the major achievement. The Americans were not a major player on the ground, the secret diplomacy at the time. If you follow the day-to-day affairs of relating to the Arab-Israeli conflict, you cannot minimize the impact, the overall impact of the direct dialogue between Israel and the Arabs. Of course, the US can provide means, the US can provide incentives. The US has always been there playing game and playing the diplomatic game and trying to facilitate peace. But basically, if I have to sum up my experience in the Arab-Israeli conflict, I would expect both to do the job. I wouldn't expect the Americans to do the job and secure peace between Israelis and Arabs. They have to do it themselves. The Americans have a very important role to play, supportive role, but not elementary, not substantial role in the solving of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That was the second question. The first question, remind me, what was the first question?
So the first question, I think, pertains to what she meant to say is, given the presence of Jews in different parts of the world, and many of the Jews are okay with the idea of not returning back to Israel.
Oh.
So under this kind of a circumstances, what she asks is like, how do you see the relevance of promised land on the contemporary understanding of Zionism?
Let me relate in a couple of minutes to the first question. I mean, the second is too complicated. The fact that Jews are not living on their land has been with us for more than 2,000 years. You know that. After the destruction of the Second Temple, the Jews were dispersed all over the world. Very few remained in Eretz Israel, in Palestine at the time. And most of the historical time that we are relating to and analyzing and studying were characterized by the, so to speak, empty land, almost empty land. The Jews were not there. The Jews started to coming to Palestine in large number in the 20th century, and the situation changed demographically tremendously during the last 20, 30 or 40 years. But if you follow the Jewish history, not Israeli history, but Jewish history, the majority of the Jews did not opt for Palestine, did not come to Palestine, did not come to Israel, even at time when they had the ability to do that. For a very long time, they were unable to do that. For example, during a certain period of time, during when the Ottoman controlled Palestine, the Ottoman did not allow the Jews to come to Palestine. So Herzl diplomacy was a very dubious way of changing that situation. But there were times in the 20s, for example, where the Jews wanted to come to Palestine and they did not. The existential fact is that side by side with Zionism, we still had for a very long time, and we had it even today, anti-Zionism. I mean, Jews who are not accepting Zionism and decide to live outside of Palestine, of Eretz Israel. The question is, your question is, how do I explain that? Very simple, very simple. For many Jews, life in the outside of Palestine is a much better life, economically, much better life, physically, much better life in terms of security, much better life in terms of way of living, Orthodox or non-Orthodox way of living. Many Jews have decided not to do that. Yeah, one of the testing time for that situation was in the early 20th century, when the Jews were forced to leave Tsarist Russia at the time. Most of them opted for the United States and not to go to Palestine. So I would accept it as a given, Zionism has won over the majority of the Jews, or almost the majority, but a large minority, even a small majority, still object to Zionism. We have to live with that.
Thank you, Professor. So we have a few more questions, if you are okay with it, sir. May I invite Dr. Mudassir to ask this question to Professor Bialer?
Thank you, Professor, for introducing your book to us. And as a student of Middle East Studies, I learned a great deal from your presentation. I have two short questions. One is regarding the Israeli foreign policy. Do you see any dichotomy in terms of Israel's geography and its aspiration in terms of its foreign policy aspirations, as well as the foreign policy ideals and practices? And secondly, I found the subtitle of your book quite interesting. So if you can shed some light on your subtitle, that would be great.
Let me start with the second one. It's the easier one. The title of the book comes from the Bible, indicating the uniqueness of Israel. I would say even the spiritual superiority of the Jews, who are not mixed up with others. They are special. They have the God blessing. They have a mission to do, and hence the offer, the observation that they are not mixed up with others. They are there. They have their aims, which really separate them from the others in terms of purity, in terms of spiritual, I would say, superiority. I'm not hesitating to use this term. And the operative rule is that they are not mixed up in the affairs of the world arena. They are standing aside. My view of the situation is different, completely different. My thesis is that the essential need made it a mandatory of Israel to mix together with the others. Israel could not live without mixing up with others. I shall give you just one tiny example. Moshe Sharet, Israel Foreign Ministry, once asked his officials to explain Israel's relation with Argentina. So some of them said that the large Jewish majority, Argentina is special in South Africa, etc., in South America, etc. So Moshe Sharet told them that you are totally wrong. All of them are totally wrong. Israel's relation with Argentina, and he spoke about the 50s, 60s, and 70s perhaps, had to do with one single word, 4 letters word, and that is MEAT, meat. Israel needs meat, the only kosher meat that Israel could get easily at the time was from Argentina, and it really controlled Israel's relations with Argentina. So that's, in kind of a blunt answer to your answer, your question. In terms of geography, I'm not sure whether I put my finger on your question, but I enjoy the benefit of being the speaker, so I'm playing with your words, putting them in my word, in my mouth. Whether geography or ideal politics really dictate Israel foreign policy, whether it's strategic really factors determine Israel's wish to hold up to the territories, or whether it is spiritual urge, the historical connection with the land, the biblical legacy, etc., which really had played the game. The answer I would give you is to differentiate between the pre-67 era and the post-67 era. In the pre-67 era, there's no doubt that really realpolitik played the game. Almost everything had to do with realpolitik, and I don't want to go into that. If you follow this post-67 era, you find something else. You found a mix between realpolitik and what historians have called the idealpolitik. All these kind of ethnocentral approaches to borders, to land, to territory, to population, which really made the situation extremely difficult. How do you reach the final verdict? Well, go and look at the result of the election. That could something hint to the situation. And as we are approaching election, as a former diplomat, I would hesitate to comment on that.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Mudassir. Professor, we will take a couple of more questions. Like there are a couple of young researchers like who have just joined this course. First, I would ask Anirban. He is my student at this university where I have just joined last month. He has a very interesting question. Anirban, if you can unmute yourself and ask Professor your question.
Uh, Thanks a lot, sir, for making me to ask the question. Actually, I have a question. What is the role of Pegasus and other disruptive intelligence technologies in Israel's foreign policy? Since we can see that the NSO and Pegasus have actually been sold to UAE, where it has been used extensively to monitor phones and other kinds of electronic devices. So, does this mean that that Israel's foreign policy and its and the kind of intelligence technologies it actually allows to sell abroad suppose authoritarianism and authoritarian ways of governance?
Let me start by saying that I haven't gone into that topic in my research. So my answer is an amateuristic kind of observation about the situation that you are speaking of. As a matter of fact, I find it even extremely difficult to follow the exact nuances in your question. Let me say something broadly. And that is that in terms of existence, Zionism started with two ideas. A, to take control over the territory, to settle the Jews, and to solve security problems. The second aim of the socialist section of Zionism was to change the character of the Jews economically speaking, social economically speaking, to change the Jews from merchants, from semi-merchants, from petty merchants into farmers. Now, for a very long time, that remained the idea, the ideology, the idea. We are far away from that. We are far away from that. In terms of economic, I think most of our gains, most of our plus in terms of the economic balance comes from computers. And Israel has become well known and famous for its ability to do that. I would say that most of our assets in terms of economic ability comes from computer. So we are back to, so to speak, normal, non-farmers. We are not farmers. We are not merchants, but we are not farmers. So something basically changed. Has that influenced Israel foreign policy? There is no doubt. Yes, the answer is yes. Economically, I spoke about economic, intelligence-wise. People are not familiar, thank God, for much of what Israel knows in terms of computers, etc. But there is no doubt that Israel has enjoyed that. In terms of politics, Israel has found it extremely easy to exchange, something from its knowledge in computers with others. And I would say that relation with China is an excellent example. And you all know better than me that relation with India benefited from Israel's excellent ability to control computers and play with computers. So the answer is definitely yes, and the future is very promising in terms of that. Easy to develop. The interesting question is how do you explain that in Israel? And I think that people who researched the issue are united in their analysis that the reasons for Israel's supremacy in terms of computer come from the early investment of the state in youngsters going to the army. So it's a national really priority, which explains the excellence. It's not public, it's not private initiative which played the major role. It's the government. So this is another reason why your question is an excellent one.
Thank you, Anirban. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Aditya, would you unmute yourself and ask Professor your question? Aditya, are you there? Please. Okay. Sir, he has some problem with his mic. So I will ask on his behalf the question that he raised for you. The question is, would it be fair to characterize US as all things being constant pro-Israel? For instance, in 1967, President Johnson warned Israel not to launch an attack first, but PM Eshkol went ahead and won the war without facing any consequences for having started the war. So this is the query he raised.
There are two parts of the
Right.
question. First of all, it had to do with U.S. Approach to Israel, attitude toward Israel. That necessitates another seminar. I won't go into that. Let me comment on the second element raised by the question. How do you explain the U.S. really agreement for Israel attack on the Arabs in '67? Why hasn't the United States reacted, punishing Israel for that? Is that a question? Is that a question?
Aditya, are you there? If you can simplify the question to, okay, then, so yeah, yes, pretty much, sir. Yes, pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a complicated question because it boils down to a question of whether the United States allowed Israel a green light, yellow light, or red light in terms of the '67 war. Whether the United States condoned Israeli actions without prior to their being taken by the Israelis, or ex post factum. I would say that the United States played a very kind of a mixed game. Very, I would say it was anything between the yellow and the green. Not the yellow and the red, but the yellow and the green. Johnson is famous of saying, you're not going to be alone if you're not choosing to be alone. But later on, we know now that secret messages passed between Washington and Jerusalem really tended towards the yellow-green and not the yellow-red. So the United States had some interest in, or was ready at the time, that's clearer. Did that make the United States pro-Israeli? Yes. In terms of the Arabs, definitely yes. Had we witnessed the solidification of the alliance immediately following the war? The answer is no. It took some time for that to solidify. But the road was certainly there, and I would say I would totally agree with the student that was a really stepping stone on the way for the United States to become a major ally of Israel.
So we have another question from Ambassador Sanjay Singh. So, Ambassador, if you can unmute yourself.
You gave a very interesting exposition of your Israel-Iran relationship during the period of the Shah. But a little aspect of this continued even afterwards. What was Israel thinking in its involvement in the Iran-Contra affair?
I'm not familiar with the topic. The question is, I would broaden the question, facilitate my answer. Because my first answer is I haven't gone into that. I would rephrase your question. Tell me if you agree. As a former diplomat, I'm playing the game. Is it right that the Israelis continue to have relation with Iran in the post-78 period? What are the Israelis expecting of Iran nowadays, or during that period of animosity? Is this okay with you? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. The answer to the first one is yes, definitely. These kind of relations are never stop. Never stop. Both sides always find it useful to keep a chain of contact with each other for various reasons. intelligence is a major reason why. And taking taking advantage of opportunities, strategic opportunities is definitely there. Of course, there are issues which connected Iran with Israel, which still exist today, material issues. For example, the Ashkelon Eilat pipeline, oil pipeline, is a common venture between Israel and Iran even today. And they're still arguing and going to court who should pay how much to one another. It's a common economic concern to both of them. So the answer is definite yes. Very little has been written about that in terms of documents, etc. But I would expect much to be relieved if and ever documents are going to be opened up. In terms of Israel's expectation of Iran, I think, to my understanding, there are two sections in Israel in terms of Iran or relation with Iran, position with Iran. The first section, I would say, is the hardliners, those who say or claim that Iran is hopeless. Iran is hopeless, and unless something very dramatic happens, it's a lost battle. And the only way that you can really do business with Iranian is using the stick. The others, the old-timers, many of those who were engaged in relation with Iran, who still remember Iran, who, if I may say so, know sometime better than those who play with Iran today, claim that situation could change even without a major counter-Muslim revolution in Iran. Something could change, and Israel had a lot to gain from a dialogue with the Iranians, and never lose hope of any opportunity to broaden this spectrum of relations. It looks like science fiction nowadays, especially under Trump, but I think people should realize that there are others in Israel who had different opinions.
Thank you for that very, very interesting answer, steeped in real politics.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Professor. I think we have had a very interesting session on the different dynamics of the foreign policy of Israel. And thanks to your book for throwing up, lots of ideas, related with the foreign policy. And I'm very much sure that some of the young scholars who have joined today have gained quite a bit of, of knowledge from your exposition and throws open lots of ideas about ways and means to study the Israeli foreign policy. And I'm very happy that, all of us could meet you in person today, despite all the things going around in different parts of the world, including in India, because of the pandemic. Thank you, sir. I really enjoyed the talk. It was an honor for me again to moderate this session for the talk given by you. And with these words, I now hand over the floor to Professor Kumarasamy.